Good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Jacobs, and you're listening to Juiced Sports Radio, alongside NFL expert Mike Kay. And we're back after a week hiatus. Hope everybody had a great holiday season. Mike, some big news in the NFL. Longtime Jacksonville Jaguars head coach Jack Del Rio, who was only the second coach in team history, practically unheard of unless you're the Steelers, fired. After a 3-8 start, the team hosts a Monday night game next week against the fading Chargers in what might be one of the worst Monday night games ever. Mike, what do you make of the news?
I had been clamoring over him losing his job for probably a season and a half, but I was just surprised it finally happened, and the fact that he was the first coach to be fired in the middle of the season, when honestly I think Steve Spagnuolo should have been fired, and Jim Caldwell should have been fired in the middle of the season as well. But, I mean, I think it's a breath of fresh air for Jaguars fans. I mean, as Wayne Weaver said in his press conference, he thought the Jaguars deserved better, and the fans deserve better. I mean, it's been a long time coming. If you look at his record, he surprisingly is only 3 games under 500 for his career coaching, which is mind-boggling to me because, you would have thought he'd lost more games. He's 68-71 as a head coach, so this year was the one that put him under 500. I mean, he's probably one of the longest tenured coaches I've ever seen that have only made the playoffs twice and only won 1 playoff game. So, I mean, I think that's in the right direction for the Jaguars.
So let me ask you this. The Jaguars win 0 AFC South titles. Granted, they happened to just be playing in the division with the Colts when Manning and Indianapolis was just running that division. But, again, second coach in team history. So was this more about Wayne Weaver finally being like, you know what, I've given you 9 years almost, and, it's just time for a change. Loyalty only goes so far. We need fresh blood. Is that what it amounts to?
Well, I think now that the Jaguars are being sold, he announced the sale at his press conference that had apparently been going on for months. I think there was no loyalty to be had. He knew a new owner was coming in. It was just a matter of time. Might as well put Jaguars fans out of their misery now. See if Mel Tucker could get the job done. He's now the interim head coach. He wants to be defensive coordinator. Gene Smith's now been re-signed their GM for 3 years. So, I mean, some of these decisions that have gone on today, I mean, I can't really put my mind around it. Some of them don't really make any sense, and then some of them are just flat out embarrassing. But the only one that does make sense is Del Rio leaving.
So let me ask you, the GM re-signed for 3 years. If you're trying to get a fresh start, why keep your general manager?
I think they like what he did. They used to have Shaq Harris, who was probably the worst GM outside of Matt Millen in the NFL over the last 15 years, and I think they just liked what Gene Smith did in comparison. I lived in Jacksonville for 4 years up until 6 months ago. So, I mean, I'm aware of their culture. They're very homegrown. They like to, match the atmosphere that they're in. Like Jacksonville, they're very blue collar. They're very tight knit, and I think that's kind of why they decided to go that route, because they had a guy who, they knew. And I guess it was better to go with the poison that they know than the poison that they don't know.
Jack Del Rio had a history of interesting quarterback decisions. He named Byron Leftwich the starter when they already had Mark Brunell in the mix. He cuts Byron Leftwich in 2007 and names Garrard the starter. This year he cuts Garrard and names McCown the starter. So you've got a plethora of some head-scratching decisions and some decisions that worked out. So where does this leave rookie quarterback Blaine Gabbert, who's had, to say in a word, a very mediocre season?
I mean, it's unfortunate. I honestly think that this is going to ruin his entire career. With a new owner, with a new head coach, normally means a new quarterback unless you've got somebody who's entrenched already. And Gabbert's had an awful season. I've said all along, I said it in my draft coverage, the kid needs time, and they didn't offer him time. They offered him an awful opportunity to play with one of the worst offenses I've ever seen. Yes, Maurice Jones-Drew is second in the league in rushing, but that only does so much when you can't score on the outside. The team's just not built to succeed on offense, and their offensive play calling has been terrible. So it's just, I don't think it's Gabbert's fault, but I do think it could be Gabbert's demise.
Is it one of those situations where you see him getting another chance next year with a new team? Do you see him sticking around in Jacksonville and getting a chance to compete for a quarterback job? I mean, the Jaguars could end up with a top 5 pick, so would it make more sense for them to go with a guy like Landry Jones or especially if he comes out, Matt Barkley, who's just been on fire lately?
I think that you draft a kid top 10, you want to give him 2 years at least. But then again, first-round picks, now that we have the pay scale in order as of this year, it's not as much of a financial burden if you want to cut your quarterback. I think what will end up happening is they'll draft a kid in the second round, maybe like a Ryan Tannehill or at Texas A&M, or they'll trade back into the first round and try to get a guy like Robert Griffin. But a lot of those franchise quarterbacks are going to go early. I just think they need so much help at wide receiver. That's part of the reason why Blaine Gabbert's failed is they have no one really at wide receiver. They have a slot receiver as their number one receiver in Mike Thomas. So I think that, their first pick should be somebody like Justin Blackmon or Alshon Jeffrey or Michael Floyd. I think that's where they're going to go because they need more playmakers. Offense is where they're struggling. Their defense has been a top 15 defense the last 3 years. So instead of, I think, last year, they need to go that route. They need playmakers, not necessarily a quarterback.
Jacksonville, well known for not getting the fan support a viable NFL team needs to truly succeed in the long term. They got a new owner coming into town after Weaver, who's owned the Jaguars forever. So what happens to Jacksonville now? What's the long-term prognosis on this team? Is this going to be the team that eventually moves to Los Angeles? It sure seems like one of those things that if you're a new owner and you don't necessarily have loyalty to the area, that why wouldn't you want to move this team to L.A.? Struggling fan base. L.A. is a viable option. They're going to build a gorgeous stadium. The fan support will be there. Why not L.A.?
I think the first reaction you're going to get is, hey, why not L.A., like you said. But they did just sign a new lease. They just renamed the stadium a few years ago. It's not necessarily the Jaguars fans' fault that they're not attending. It's just the area they're in. The economy's hurt Jacksonville significantly. They're in a football town, but it's a Florida Gator football town. So to compete with Florida, it's just going to be hard for any pro team. They're still a young team. They've only been around since the mid-'90s. They'll get their fan support up, I think. I think people are over Wayne Weaver. I think Wayne Weaver is probably one of the cheaper owners ever. I think if they can bring in a big name, which I don't think they will as a head coach, I think that they can succeed. Their defense has definitely gotten better over the last 2 years with all the signings they had this year. And, there's a bright future there. They haven't really had a ton of blackouts like they used to over the last 2 years. And, I think they're on the upswing. I just don't know how much of an upswing they can be on.
I'm going to get you out on this one. Bill Cowher's the hot name out there. He bought a house in Jacksonville a couple of years ago. But as you said, the defense is pretty solidified in Jacksonville. So if I'm the Jaguars, I'm looking for an offensive guy. Who would be a good fit? Not necessarily a pie-in-the-sky candidate, but just a good, as you said, blue-collar coach for them. Who could be their next coach, in your opinion?
There's a few options you could go with. The problem is that most assistant coaches aren't the standout, assistants aren't offensive. There's the offensive coordinator for the Saints. You could look into, you could look into the offense. You could look into Cam Cameron again, I guess, with Baltimore, but that probably won't happen after how he did with the Dolphins.
I don't think I would go in that direction.
Todd Haley, if he gets fired from the Chiefs, could be a very likely option. He went to school at UNF, University of North Florida in Jacksonville. So, that could be a pretty good publicity stunt. And you know what? He's a fiery coach, and he gets a lot out of his players. Which, if he was hired or fired from Kansas City, I could see Matt Castle getting cut too and ending up in Jacksonville. I don't think people in Jaguars land wouldn't mind that at all as a competition for Blaine Gabbert. And then you have Jay Gruden, who's in his first year as an offensive coordinator in Cincinnati, but he's done wonders for Andy Dalton. Norv Turner could be a guy too, but I don't think Jaguars fans are really into that idea because he's basically a quarterback coach who calls plays. And, it's bleak on offense. I mean, I think Mike Zimmer is assistant coach number 1 in the league, and I think he's a hot name for everybody, so he could be potentially their solution. But if you bring in a guy like Bill Cowher, realize this. It took him 13 years to win a Super Bowl. I know everybody says that he got to the Super Bowl early in his career, but he lost it. And he also won the Super Bowl in probably the worst refereed Super Bowl I've ever seen in my life. It's a fact that no head coach has won a Super Bowl for two separate teams. That's never happened. So, there's caveats with hiring a guy who's a notable name.